stream this or bring Dr. Soraya Coley on board from Pomona, were it not for all the help from IT and all the tech people who do their thing. And the lead on this is, of course, Faust Gorham, but na, 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 na. In case you missed it. Well, I was just thanking IT for their terrific help, and they have been wonderful. I better stop. I'd like to make another joke, but it's
Gotta give it a try. Live stream's coming back.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you, Faust. And I was about to say that I particularly wanted to thank Thomas McClendon of IT for all he's done. He has been working behind the scenes and essentially since I don't know when today. Most. Only I thought of that. Just, yes. Test 1, 2. We think we are ready for liftoff. Okay, one note, and that is that there will be opportunities for questions in 2 different points in our program. The first is after our panelists present, and the second is after Dr. Dugan's presentation, which wraps up the evening. So let's get the program rolling. I want to begin by inviting my colleague in the history department, Dr. Kiran Garcha, to come forward. She's a specialist in African American history, and she will provide a short presentation focusing on the Little Rock Nine and the historical context for that. Dr. Garcha? Okay.
Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. All right, great. Good evening, everyone. All right. Thank you, Dr. Vivian, for the introduction. I also want to thank my colleagues, my colleagues on the Public History Institute's planning committee for putting this together. I want to thank Dr. Zalesny, Provost Harper, for sharing their time with us. I know time is precious, so thank you for being here. I also want to thank our panelists and speaker, Drs. Mitchell, Coley, Wallace, and Dr. Dugan for making this event a reality. So thank you. All right, so I'm going to try my best. I have a lot to say, but I know we're limited for time, so I'm going to try my best to move through this quickly. Let me just make sure I know. Okay, awesome. All right, so a little over a week ago, I was among many folks in the community that were privileged and honored to hear Carlotta Walls LaNier speak, the youngest member of the Little Rock Nine, speak about her experiences in this critical moment in our country's history. And among the many inspiring aspects of her talk, one comment in particular stood out to me, and it's less of a comment as it is a single word she used to talk about her experiences. Someone in the audience asked her, how did you get through it? All the hardship, the hostility that was coming at students from multiple directions. And she replied by saying, it took grit. That's the word she used. And it really stood out to me. And I thought, in the context of the civil rights movement, there's a powerful history behind this tiny 4-letter word, right? So I kind of want to piggyback my comments, the historical context I'll be providing tonight off of this idea of grit. Perseverance, the tremendous mental and physical fortitude, right, that the Little Rock Nine and their families practiced, exercised in the face of tension, hostilities, again, coming at them from multiple directions. So that's what I'd like to frame my comments around tonight. Now, I'm going to skip over that slide. For West Coast kids, such as myself, it's always useful to have maps. Anytime you're trying to figure out the geography of any place outside of California. How many of you in the audience have been to Arkansas before? Oh, wow. Okay, quite a few folks. How many of you have been to Little Rock, Arkansas? Okay, almost just as many. Well, I didn't realize how smack dab in the middle of the state that Little Rock is. It's like they built the state around the central city of Little Rock. So the push for equal access to quality education for Black children in Little Rock, Arkansas goes back decades before Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Over a long trend of conflicts between local civil rights leaders, community residents, and the city's governing elite. And in many ways, the policies pursued by civic leaders over this period typified those of the South in the era of Jim Crow segregation. In cities and towns across the South and outside of the South as well, local politicians often understood the provision of education to white children as a civic responsibility to be shouldered by Southern taxpayers. And at the same time, they expected private philanthropies and Black parents to assume a significant proportion of the costs of educating Black students. That was certainly the case in Little Rock, Arkansas. For decades, Little Rock school officials relied on Northern philanthropy and fundraising efforts by local Black residents to supplement inadequate public funding for Black schools. And over time, Little Rock's Black parents grew tired of the burdens imposed by a system of partially privatized, poorly funded, and segregated Black schools and sought improvement through equalization and integration. And a key example of this pattern can be seen in the cases of two schools, one of which we've all been hearing about in the past couple of weeks, and this is Central High School. It was originally named Little Rock High School, but became renamed later on, which was established in 1927. And Dunbar School, which was both a junior and senior high school, established 2 years later. So whereas Little Rock High School was funded by local and state taxpayers at a cost of $1.5 million, Dunbar Junior and Senior High School was built out of $400,000, part of which was supported by private grant money. Public funds bought more books for Little Rock High School than they did for the library at Dunbar. Dunbar also lacked the science labs equipment, a gymnasium, band instruments, and other resources that school officials funded for Little Rock High School. And in 1938, Black residents began asking for a gym and a health center at Dunbar, with no concessions by school authorities, who only 6 years later suggested that the residents look for private funding for these facilities. It wouldn't be until 1949, 11 years after their request, that they finally received public funds for these facilities. So importantly, this back and forth between, sorry, let me catch my place. Yes, importantly, this back and forth between parents and local officials underscores the central role of local public officials who had decision-making power when it came to educational funding, in contributing to the gradualism or near stagnation in the movement for educational equality and equity. So not long after, local Black leaders and white liberals formed the interracial Little Rock Council on Schools and issued a report in 1952 documenting the poor state of public schools for Little Rock's Black children. The report focused particularly on the situation at Dunbar and concluded that the school's facilities, staffing levels, curriculum, and budget were inferior to those in local white schools. The report went further, highlighting segregation itself as a barrier to equal educational opportunities. The report stated that Black students' separation from, quote, the cultural advantages of the privileged majority impaired their ability to acquire that part of education which the white child learns not necessarily through formal instruction, but acquires more indirectly from fellow students and teachers. With its report completed, the Council on Schools proposed informally to the Little Rock School Board that it consider opening some classes at Little Rock High School to selected Black students. The council, along with the local branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, hoped that such an informal negotiation would enable it to persuade the board to begin the process of dismantling segregation without a lawsuit. And how did the school board respond? Well, it refused to meet with the council first and foremost. The school superintendent, Harry A. Little, wrote a letter to the school board taking issue with some of the conclusions drawn by the council, the school council. He justified the broader curricula at Little Rock High School and Technical School, another local white high school, noting that Dunbar offered courses not available at the two white high schools, including bricklaying and trade laundry. Ultimately, the local NAACP did file a suit against the school board in the case Aaron v. Cooper in February of 1956. But even before that case was brought, another much larger court case took place in 1954, in May of 1954, and that is Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. With this US Supreme Court case, the court unanimously ruled that segregation in public schools represented a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, declaring that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. So this effectively, in part, upended an earlier US Supreme Court case known as Plessy v. Ferguson that was passed in 1896, which legalized at a national level a system of racial apartheid in the United States. This helped to kind of chisel away at that. It didn't completely overturn it, but it was a huge, unprecedented step. All right, as monumental as it was, Brown v. Board of Education was limited in that it did not explicitly provide a roadmap for how desegregation would take place. That would not be addressed until the following year with Brown v. Board of Education 2, in which, again, in Brown v. Board of Education 2, the federal court again evaded a clear plan of enforcement by defining the standard of implementation of desegregation as transpiring with, quote, all deliberate speed, right? Not only did it do that, not only did it leave this vagueness in the wording of the decision, but it further charged federal district courts with the task of establishing guidelines for compliance. So as you can imagine, this placed tremendous power and discretion in deciding the fate of public school desegregation in the hands of federal court judges. All right, so the superintendent of the Little Rock School Board unsurprisingly embraced a plan of gradual integration in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education. His plan was to start integrating the schools in September of 1957, starting at the high school level and continuing with lower, younger grades over the course of the next 6 years, right? This is what I mean by gradual, right? I mentioned earlier that the local NAACP did sue the school board in the winter of 1956. And while the federal judge overseeing that case ruled in favor of the school board with its plan of gradual integration, because the federal district court retained jurisdiction over the case, the school board's integration plan now became a court mandate. So they had to eventually abide by their plan of gradual integration, right? Okay, I'm keeping my eye on the clock here. So on September 4th, 1957, the group that would become known as the Little Rock Nine arrived at Central High School for the first day of school as part of this integration process. Along with an angry mob of white students and parents that had descended on the school's campus, the 9 Black students were also met by troops from the Arkansas National Guard, as we see in the image here. These troops had been ordered into Little Rock 2 days prior by Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus to prevent the children from entering the school. It was in this moment that Little Rock became a singularly powerful regional, national, and international symbol of violent resistance to federal desegregation efforts and to racial change, but also a symbol of resistance and perseverance by Black families in the face of white mob violence. After a federal court injunction forced the governor to remove the state troops from Central Rock High School, Little Rock police attempted unsuccessfully to prevent mayhem when the Black students entered the school campus again on September 23rd. This time confronted by a menacing segregationist mob that included over 1,000 white students, parents, and a group of white women who formed something called the Mothers League of Central High School, which collaborated with local white supremacist organizations, including the Citizens Council. After escorting the students inside the building, by midday, local police officers felt that they could not adequately protect the students. So midday, that school day, they ended up taking them all home for their safety. So they didn't make it fully through a full day of school. The following day, on September 24th, President Dwight D. Eisenhower asserted federal authority by federalizing the Arkansas National Guard and deploying 1,200 members of the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. Under the protection of these federal troops, here's an image of the members of the 101st Airborne Division. Under the protection of these federal troops in military gear and equipment, the 9 students were escorted back to Central High School for the first full day of school on September 25th, 1957. So it's a powerful image when you think about federal troops being deployed into a school campus just to make sure that children can attend school, right? One of the most interesting aspects of the case of the Little Rock Nine and how it played out has to do with the timing of it all. The tumultuous events taking place in Little Rock were unfolding against the backdrop of a global Cold War. Little Rock had become a worldwide spectacle and a poignant example for Soviet and Soviet-aligned nations to highlight the fallacies in America's self-proclaimed democratic ideals. And Eisenhower was very aware of this. In fact, there's another layer to this story. At the same time that the state and federal government entities were dragging their feet when it came to legally dismantling America's system of racial apartheid, the federal government was sponsoring a project of cultural diplomacy in which it hired world-renowned jazz musicians to perform in newly emerging nations across the globe as goodwill ambassadors who would promote the notions of liberty and freedom through music. I know some of my students in here have heard of the jazz ambassadors. In fact, in the wake of Orville Faubus's deployment of the Arkansas National Guard to Central High School, one of these jazz ambassadors, pictured in this photograph here, Louis Armstrong, who had been touring various countries as a representative of the cultural diplomacy program and as someone who identified with the civil rights movement in the South, he publicly denounced the governor's actions as well as Eisenhower's foot dragging. He had already visited Ghana in 1956 on the eve of its independence, but when the US State Department asked him to go on tour in the Soviet Union and South America, he declined. It wasn't until after Eisenhower sent those federal troops into Little Rock to ensure that the students would be able to safely enter Central High School that that Armstrong eventually applauded Eisenhower for doing something. He sent the president a telegram praising his actions and indicating that he might change his mind about touring for the State Department, noting, quote, "If you decide to walk into the schools with the colored kids, take me along, Daddy. God bless you." So this is a telegram that he sent to the President of the United States. May 25th, 1958, Ernest Green of the Little Rock Nine became the first African-American student to graduate from Central High School. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end here. For the next year, over the following year, there was a lot of continued infighting at the local level between parents, local officials, school board officials about how to desegregate the school. I see Miriam giving me the sign, the watch sign. So I'm not gonna go into all of that. I do have a clip, if we have time, that I would like to play. And this is, again, Ernest Green, the first Black student to graduate from Central High School, reflecting on his experience. So if you could play that clip, please.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
The governor of the state, Orville Forbes, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the nine anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day, the National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school. What it was like, it was rejection that I had never experienced like that. It seemed to me that if they were going to all of this trouble to keep me out, there was something bigger than my simply going to class. Only when we got home from school that day did we realize what an ordeal, personal ordeal, Elizabeth had gone through, and that she certainly faced more of the mob directly. I always applaud the fact that she was able to keep both her composure and try to figure out how to get out of that. We started school on the 25th of September.
President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army.
It was a terrific feeling that President of the United States would send troops to escort us into school. I didn't know what was going to happen after that. It was like going to war every day. You had students who tried to use as much verbiage as they could to intimidate us. We had threats and comments that, we would be killed. For all of us, we decided that this was a year that we were going to support each other. We were going to try to do as well as we could in our academic work. Some were a lot smarter than me, but I also was determined that this year I was going to graduate from Central. The principal of the school told me at one point along the way that I didn't have to come to the ceremony. They would mail me my diploma. And I thought, listen, I didn't go through all this to pass up the ceremony. Maybe the world thought that after Little Rock, everything is going to be fixed. And one of the important pieces, I'm sure I don't need it to remind anyone, that the history of slavery in this country makes it very difficult to overcome a lot of issues on race. We're a long way from being perfect, but we certainly are not what we were when I started out. I believe that our participation at Central is one of those many steps that's gone to change this country for the better.
Okay, so in closing, I just want to say just quickly, in the context of educational equity, it's not lost on me that I teach Black history and I'm not Black. I think it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that I'm taking valuable space that could be held by someone who is Black, right? And I think it speaks importantly to the national problem of Black faculty and students being underrepresented in post-secondary education, right? We know that students do better in school when they're able to work with and learn from mentors and teachers who look like them and who share similar life and cultural experiences. So as we continue to grow as a campus, I think it's important that we keep advocating for more Black faculty and Black retention and graduation. I think Little Rock 9 is a model example of what it takes to close the racial equity gap in education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Garcha, for your valuable insights and your remarks and that terrific clip, which I think in a very vivid way helps bring that terror really home that those students experienced. It's now my pleasure to invite our panelists to make their way to the podium and for Mr. Kurt Asher to stand by at the ready as the Dean Emeritus of the library here. Mr. Asher will be our moderator. So you guys, anybody need assistance? I know we're here to hear their remarks, so I will keep introductions fairly brief, but all three of these panelists have had very impressive academic careers, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that, at least in a small way. So Dr. Horace Mitchell was the fourth president of CSUB and served here for 14 years until his retirement in 2018. So there are many of us still around who remember him fondly. Having earned his academic degrees from Washington University in St. Louis, he served as a professor of psychology at UC Irvine, where he also held administrative positions. From there, he was an administrator at UC Berkeley before arriving at CSUB. Dr. Soraya Coley, with advanced degrees from Bryn Mawr College, is currently president of Cal Poly Pomona and its first female president. Before this, she served as provost and vice president for academic affairs here at CSUB after serving several years as a faculty member and administrator at CSU Fullerton. Dr. Thomas Wallace serves as the Vice President for Student Affairs at CSUB, and thus many of you know him well, and has been here since 2012. After a stint as Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, he spent 20 years as a professor of educational leadership at the University of Mississippi, his alma mater. Prior to that, he was a K-12 teacher and principal. So I will invite Mr. Asher to come forward, but before he begins his questions, I want to invite our panelists to make any opening or introductory remarks that they would like. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Dr. Vivian, and thank the Public History Institute, and thank you, Madam President. It's a pleasure to join you here this evening And I am excited that there is so much interest in this history. It's very important history. And in order to know where we are now, we obviously need to know where we've come from. And from that, and from our experiences today, we need to project how it is that we will move forward beyond the current circumstances. There's been progress, but there's still a long way to go. What I'd like to do is to make some opening remarks, and at a couple of points, it's going to overlap with some things that you said. So I'm going to make that part really short. I'll start off by saying that I was born in a small segregated town in Mississippi in the mid-1940s. It was a time of significant racism, social inequality, and harassment of African Americans. The Supreme Court decision that was referred to earlier in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 had ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. And that became the legal basis for racial segregation in the United States for the next 60 years. Back in terms of Mississippi, there were white signs on everything. Water fountains, benches, restrooms, doors, and many other locations. And there were signs on similar but less desirable locations labeled, quote, colored. And part of the set of Jim Crow laws, as they're referred to, required that Black people sit in the back of the bus, the back of the train, the back of the movie theater, and all of those kinds of things. In addition, there were frequent reports of Black men being lynched across the state of Mississippi and in other southern states. On at least one occasion, as I was a child, I witnessed hooded Ku Klux Klansmen on horseback riding through the Black section of town, carrying torches, burning torches, and yelling racial epithets at members of my family and others in the Black community. It was within that context that I lived until about age 10, when with my parents and siblings, and my grandparents and other relatives who lived in the same community. I had an awareness of the racial environment, yet at the same time, somehow, I had a notion that at some point in my life, I would be able to make a difference. And just to give you a quick sense of this notion that I had, my first name, Horace, has in it 3 words as part of it, ACE, HORACE, ACE. And it also has in it 4 letters, I said words, letters, race, HORACE. And so I had this notion somehow as a child that I would become a, quote, ace of my race. Okay? Now, don't ask me how I thought that, but somehow I thought that this was a bad enough situation that at some point I would be able to have an impact on that. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that was referred to earlier ruled that state-sanctioned segregation of public schools was a violation of the 14th Amendment as previously stated. And it overruled the separate but equal principle set forth in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And it also signaled the end of legalized racial segregation. 1 year later, again, after, as was pointed out, the court ruled that schools needed to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And as we all know, the struggle did not end there. It was, and this would come up in one of the questions, but I included it in what I'm saying here. It was the lynching of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black boy visiting Mississippi from Chicago in 1995, only 48 miles from where we live, that led to my parents' decision to move the family from Mississippi to St. Louis in order to search for a better life. And I want to add one last comment about this. There were efforts to get an anti-lynching law passed before the lynching of Emmett Till. His mother's decision to have an open casket at his funeral created widespread awareness of that particular case and that crime. And the funeral director wanted to, make that his face look better. And his mother said, no, I want the world to see what they've done to my son. And that created a lot of press, a lot of magazine articles, etc. And that fact and her taking that position on his funeral really intensified efforts to get an anti-lynching law passed. Took a long time before that happened. And so after more than 65 years, Congress passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which was signed by President Biden in March of this year. You see how long that took? Okay. So, and I would encourage you to, if you have an opportunity, and I don't recommend movies, but Barbara and I had the opportunity to see the movie Till, which is the story of not only the lynching of Emmett Till, but also, again, his mother's struggle to deal with it herself and to let the world know what had happened to her son in order to get justice. So I recommend to you that you see that film. It's currently viewing, and Barbara and I saw it last week, and it has a lot of personal meaning and points of reflection for me with that situation having occurred so close to where my family lived. Thank you.
I apologize, Dr. Mitchell. I did not dissect my name. Maybe I should. The civil rights movement is considered the time from 1954 to 1968. It was a tumultuous time for many Black Americans. while Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was decided in 1954, it was not until 1969-70 that the segregation of schools occurred in most of the South and some of the eastern cities like Boston. After attending segregated schools in grades 1st through 8th, I was in the 9th grade before attending an integrated school. Under court order busing, I attended Airways Junior High in Memphis, Tennessee. As a high school student, I attended integrated schools in St. Anne, Illinois, and Hernando, Mississippi. I was involved in sports, chorus. I was elected senior class president and Hall of Fame. In pursuing my bachelor's degree at Northwest Mississippi Community College and the University of Mississippi, I never had a Black professor. It was not until I pursued my master's degree that I had my first Black professor. My grandmother was a pioneer for civil rights and worked to establish systems of justice that would be fair to all people. I'll reserve my other comments for the questions that will be asked. Thank you.
Dr. Foley?
Well, first of all, it's good seeing everyone, and thank you so much for accommodating me. I was planning to be there in person, but I had an unexpected reaction to receiving a COVID booster shot and a flu shot simultaneously, and so I am just now kind of getting equilibrium. Again, thank you so much for inviting me. And Kurt, it's great seeing you. Haven't seen you in a while. And also, I want to thank our president, your president, and also Dr. Vivian to welcome us. I know that you've got a set of questions that you wanted to present to us, and so I will integrate some of my comments, reflections on my background in the questions that you ask. So, Kurt.
Thank you. So, first question I was going to start with is something that has been talked about a little, actually quite a bit, but I think you can give some more personal perspective here. While Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, it wasn't until the mid to late 60s that many Southern schools were desegregated. I think it may be hard for people to understand the barriers and restrictions that African Americans faced in this era, and not just in school, but in life in general. Could you talk a little about your experience going to school and living under segregation as a child?
I'll start. As I said, I lived in the early days in a small segregated town in Mississippi, and I went to the Booker T. Washington Elementary School. All right, and there was not at that point much about racial integration of schools because the city was totally segregated, and the Black schools were in the Black community, and the white schools were in the white community. And there were never any efforts to change that while I was in that age. Much later, and we can get to this later, when I was an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis, I became a consultant for the Midwest Race and Sex Desegregation Center, which was housed at the University of Kansas. And along with a cadre of other consultants, we provided training for desegregating schools throughout the Midwest. And those experiences were very enlightening you know, at a point when you think, you know, it's patently obvious that there's discrimination going on, that people would recognize that and look to do something different. But time and again, it didn't happen. And so for me, that time spent as a consultant allowed me to get a perspective on what was happening in a broad set of states having to do with efforts to desegregate schools.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Soraya? Dr. Colin?
Yes, thank you so much for that that question. And in fact, these questions have brought up emotions that are always there and sometimes simmering. But I want to just say that what I think is important from my perspective in understanding is the decision that parents have to make in order to protect their child's sense of self-worth. The decisions that being in a segregated community, that you have to still affirm your child. And one of my earliest experiences was my mother and I would walk uptown, as they would refer to it. And there would be on many occasions where I would be, or we would be told to get off the sidewalk. And my mother would do it very dutifully. And one particular day we walked into what was called the Woolworth store. And some of you may recall now it may be the equivalent of going to a Walmart. But there in the Woolworth store, there was a lunch counter, and there was a little white girl sitting at the lunch counter eating a hot dog. And I got away from my mother and rushed to sit beside this little girl because I wanted a hot dog. Now, what does a parent say? How does a parent react to their child just being very earnest, very active? And so my mother had to decide, do I tell her about the bluntness and the evils of racism? Or do I try to protect her sense of self? So what my mother told me, and she immediately, and I could see in her face the anxiety of me sitting beside this little white girl. Again, this was like in 1955, 56. And she pulled me off from the counter and she said, "It's not polite to eat in public." Now, what that said to me is that my mother had to find a way to keep me as a 5, 6, 7-year-old from the harshness and the cruelty of racism. She said, "I will fix you a hot dog when we get home." And so when you talk about the experiences of going to school and living under segregation as a child, the challenge for African-American parents, the challenge for the all-Black teachers is to provide some sense of emotional self-worth, of knowing that you are okay just the way you are. And that is a challenge for parents protecting their child. And I recall as we would travel to my grandmother, again, 6, 7 years old, and I think it was referenced that I would get on the bus and I would immediately sit on the front seat. And my mother would say, "Well, we're going to sit in the back because I brought food, books, and games, and we don't want to disturb the driver. Now, it's very clear that by the time I was 9, 10, 11 years old, that I understood what was happening. But what I appreciated about my mother was every effort for as long as she could to protect my sense of who I am and my sense of worth. Now, anybody that knows me, I used to have to commute from Bakersfield to the LAX. And I was always the first one on the bus sitting on the front seat because it was very clear to me, it was symbolic. I would get to the bus station a half an hour ahead of time to sit on the front seat. But that's where and it has changed since we supposedly have the laws that ban this, but we know that it is still a challenge for parents, for communities to protect their innocent children from all of the negativity that one experiences. And while you don't see the billboards as I did driving that says the N word, you don't see the Klan as I did, you still know that in so many people, it's still in their hearts. And that's the challenge that we have as a society. How do we continue to make clear the connections that we should have in order to have a stronger society?
Thank you, Dr. Kohler. Dr. Wallace?
As I stated earlier, in grades 1 through 8, I attended segregated schools. If you noticed, I did not say kindergarten because we didn't have kindergarten. It just started with first grade. And so grades 1 through 8, what we had was a quality school. And when I say that, sometimes people misunderstand that segregation means that you didn't get the quality education that you deserve. We got a quality education. What we didn't get were the buildings, the supplies, the books. Those were things that were subpar. But the nurturing environment we had. My grandmother selected every teacher that I had in grades 1 through 8. My first grade teacher was also my mother's first grade teacher. So the experiences that we received were very good. But what integration brought was the fact that we needed buildings, we needed labs, we needed transportation. Those were the things that were needed that we could only get through integrating the schools. So I want to make sure that you understand that part, because sometimes people have the impression that we got a subpar education, and let me assure you, we did not.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. There were a lot of events of direct traumatizing racial violence that took place across the country, particularly in the South. And you've mentioned Emmett Till, but maybe you could talk about how these events affected and shaped you as a youth beyond that.
Well, as I said, there were reports of lynchings throughout the state. And it was the lynching of Emmett Till that brought the greatest amount of tension and attention. And my family was not the first family to make the decision to move away, because it was very clear that it was a dangerous place to be. And you didn't have to do much if you were Black, where people would say, hey, he did this or that or the other, incorrectly or intentionally incorrectly, to have that serve as a basis for dragging them out of their home, taking them somewhere, and then lynching. Okay. And so there's a song by one of the legendary Black women singers. And I can't forget, I forget which one it is now. But the song title was Strange, somebody knew that, Strange Fruit. Absolutely. And who was it? Billie Holiday. Yes, Billie Holiday. Thank you. Strange Fruit. And her reference to strange fruit was Black men hanging from trees. That was strange fruit. But it was very common. And all of those kinds of circumstances didn't go away when laws were passed, and the Supreme Court made decisions, et cetera. And, those things continue to happen.
Dr. Coley?
Yes, I don't know if I'd mentioned that my context is having grown up in North Carolina. And I think some of the similar experiences that have been shared certainly were part of my experience. I went to all segregated schools, and I really want to highlight what Dr. Wallace mentioned, because we got the hand-me-down books with pages torn. We got the raggedy lab equipment. But what we received from our teachers was a confirmation of our ability to learn. And many of them during the summers would go away for graduate school and come back and continue to reinforce and make sure that we were confident in understanding that we were smart, we were talented, and that we would not allow anyone, as the old spiritual says, turn me around. In terms of one incident that stands out most for me is with my grandmother. My grandmother was a leader in the rural community. My grandparents grew up on had a farm, and my grandmother, during the Voting Rights Act, she paid careful attention to that because she felt that we living in this country should have the right to vote. And when it was finally passed, because you may have heard or recall that when you would go to vote, you would have all kinds of barriers to voting, including having to guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, or all of the kinds of things. Or if you were not able to count, you would be asked an arithmetic question. And depending upon how you responded, you could vote or not vote. Well, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, my grandmother was very determined to get older Blacks in the community to come out to vote. Some of you may have seen the movie, the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. And as she is moving up to exercise her right as a citizen. Well, my grandmother, because she was very active, she was threatened. And so we were very concerned about her safety. We made sure that the taxes were paid on the farm because we knew that there would be an attempt to hurt or harm in some way the voice of this powerful Black woman. And so when you think about these kinds of events and how they shape you, it was clear that I did not take for granted the rights that we have achieved. I don't take for granted that these rights will remain, as much as I would like to have that as something that one could be hopeful or clear about. And so I think that these events have certainly shaped my thinking, the way I engage with this work. And I think that it certainly affected me as a young person, because I understood that while one could expect to achieve justice, the experience of African Americans in this country was that justice was always just a little bit delayed. You know, we celebrated Juneteenth, and I made the comments that for us in North Carolina, my stepfather was a minister, Southern Baptist minister, and instrumental in helping to subsequently integrate the local community. But that what became very clear is that we celebrated January 1st as the Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of other folks celebrated Juneteenth. And what we understood is that Juneteenth was about delayed justice, the emancipation. This is 5-6 months even after it had been signed. And even after Juneteenth, there were 2 or 3 other months before full quote unquote freedom was allowed. So these stories help to see the continuity across many generations, and it also propels us to continue this important work.
Dr. Wallace?
There are 2 incidents that are emblazed in my mind. The first was the integration of schools. And as a 9th grader, we were attending a school that we were bused to. Now, some of you don't know the term busing, but busing was a way of integrating the schools that had not integrated, meaning that we're going to take you out of your neighborhood and force you to go to another school to gain that balance of races. So I was bused out of my neighborhood to Airways Junior High. And it was Airways because it was close to the airport. And so at this school, the first 2 weeks of school, tension was very high. So this particular morning, Mr. Williams, who was the principal, came on the intercom and he said, I want all of the teachers to step outside of your door and close the door. And you can only imagine what's going through my mind at this point. So my homeroom teacher was Mr. Ramsey, Coach Ramsey. He steps out, closes the door. Mr. Williams says at this point, if you have a weapon of any type in your pocket, I want you to go to the window and toss it out. So everybody's looking around in the room, and he reiterated that we're going to begin searching lockers and searching individuals. Anyone with a weapon of any type will be expelled. So people started getting up, going to the window, tossing out. I mean, you saw knives, brass knuckles. Even in my homeroom, there was one gun. And then the little girl sitting next to me that I thought I knew, her name was Beth. And Beth got up, and Beth had a knife about this long. And I said, oh no, not Beth. Beth walks to the window and tosses the knife out. At that point, you could tell that something was wrong. But I'm also a strong believer in sports and bringing a school together. And at this particular school, we won the championship in football. We won the championship in basketball. We won the championship in baseball. You could see us all coming together through sports, and it truly made a difference at that school. The other incident is that I was attending school in Memphis when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And seeing what took place following that assassination is not something I ever want to see again. And the looting and what was taking place and people destroying property, it was not something that any of us ever want to be involved in.
Thank you. Did you want to say something else?
Right. Let me just add to what has been said by bringing in some experiences of my wife, our former First Lady, Barbara Mitchell, right here. And that is that while I said I was always in schools that were segregated, so to speak, but they were still neighborhood schools. In Barbara's case, she grew up in St. Louis, and as part of desegregation, there was a decision that some of the top students at her elementary school would be bused essentially across town to an all-white school so that there would be this desegregation. And I want to be clear that, and most of you would know this, that there's a difference between desegregation and integration, right? Desegregation simply means that there are people from different backgrounds in the same place. Integration means that there's a real integration of schools, curricula, teachers, students, etc. So anyway, Barbara had a bus ride of an hour each way, okay? And as she was looking at the Little Rock 9, she and I were looking at each other and nodding, because she has recounted, beginning years ago, her experience where the group of Black students who were bused to the other side of town had instructions, you know, from people in the church that says, you know, be careful what you do, be careful what you say, and, you know, these kinds of things to make sure that they were protecting themselves. But again, as Dr. Coley said, without suggesting that there was anything wrong with them, but that they needed to be ready to deal with the situation. And so Barbara has said that the parents were worse than the kids. And there were times when rocks were thrown at her and the other students, tomatoes and other kinds of things. And there was a lot of angst in the Black community about that busing, because they said, on the one hand, the best and brightest students here are being sent somewhere else, and they would be graduating from a different elementary school. And so the agreement was that the students, Barbara and her cohort, would return to their home school for the 7th and 8th grade so that they could graduate from their local elementary school. And she said that even as they returned, they weren't welcomed with open arms, because the other kids say, well, you've been gone, or now you talk funny, or other kinds of things, you know, that had to do with being in a different environment. Now, obviously, they overcame all of that. But nonetheless, for someone who's 7, 8, 9 years old, that's problematic. And so we actually have on the wall at our home in Huntington Beach a picture of Bridges. What's the first name? Ruby, right, Ruby Bridges, with the National Guard escorting her into school. And that was the kind of thing that Barbara remembers very, very vividly, so much so that when we saw this particular art piece, she says, we got to get that. And it's been hanging on our wall for years.
Anything else on this? Okay, next question. Saraya, you've talked a bit about the family, child, parent relationship, but I'm going to ask this question now. Could you talk a little about your parent-family relationships and how they tried to shield or protect you from the injustice of segregation? I guess we'll go in the same order. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Dr.
Well, I
Cole.
think I'll defer to my fellow panelists. I think I've just, you gave a couple of examples. I would note that for me, I felt very blessed to have the family that I did, who really worked to make sure that I felt okay about myself. I also, growing up in a segregated community with, when I looked at the power dynamics over me, when I looked at what success looked like, again, I'm talking about as an elementary school child, my sense were, the teachers who looked like me, the accountability from people who looked like me, the encouragement from people who looked like me. And so from nursery school till 12th grade, it was all segregated. And so I and my stepfather, who was instrumental in desegregating the town. In fact, one of the debates that I remember my mother and stepfather having was that as they were integrating Goldsboro High School, my stepfather, as one would have expected, wanted me to be in that first class. And my mother said, and I think I was probably nearing my senior year or junior year, and she said, no, they will not love her like they love her here at Dillard. And so I finished my 12th grade year in the segregated school. There were certainly classmates that I had that were part of the, as you talked about earlier, with the integration of Central High and others. But there was a clear, what was inculcated within me is that you do not take freedom, justice, access for granted, that it will always be a struggle, and that you have to find, regardless of your role, you have to find ways in order to make sure that the values that you hold dear and the ability to open doors for others, that is underpins your work, whatever your job is. And so I really value the way in which my parents and family members really work to shield, but at the same time make blatant the evils that were all around. And that's a challenge for parents. What do you say to your child that you're okay when everything around you, as they talked about the water cooler, and some of you who know me can imagine that I was a pretty precocious child, and always I remember the fear that was exuded when we were in the bus station. There were two water fountains, the colored water fountain and the white water fountain. And the colored wasn't working, so I went to the white one. I can't tell you how many folks were rushing to grab me, to take me from the white water fountain. And what do you, again, imagine what you as a parent, how do you say to your child that you're still okay, but society says you're not? And I think that's, in so many ways, while it may not be as blatant as it was then, that's still what is facing our country today. How do we affirm our children regardless of background? How do our institutions affirm our children regardless of background? When you're in the classrooms, how do you say to a child that is insecure or may be different from other classmates that you belong? And so I appreciate the values that were incorporated within me as a very young child.
Thank you. Dr. Mitchell.
Well, again, Barbara and I have been married now for 56 years. And we've shared a lot of our earlier experiences. And just picking up on something that Soraya was saying, Barbara would recall that when her family would drive from St. Louis to Starkville, Mississippi, where her grandparents lived, that her mother would always say, we're going to fix some chicken, you know, because we don't want to stop at these eating places because, you know, the food there isn't good. You know, same sort of thing that Soraya was saying. But also she said something that I hadn't experienced, and that was that one time we were driving through Mississippi, going from where my grandmother lived in Clarksdale to where her grandmother lived in Starkville. And one of the kids turned on the interior light, and Barbara jumped, no, you know, turn that light out, you know, because people will see us. And if people see us driving and it's dark, then, you know, we could become victims of some racism on the part of some people. And so the thing was that you always drove with the lights out in the car. Most people do that anyway, but sometimes, you know, there's a need to turn the light on in order to find where the drumstick is and the chicken box or something like that. But again, you know, there is this sensitivity that you have to have, and you have to have a way, as Soraya was saying, to explain it to kids without suggesting that there's something wrong with them.
I see.
And so these things happen all the time.
Dr. Walls, can he? Yeah.
Yeah. My grandparents protected us. During the week, we didn't expect to go anywhere that was not school related or church related. And we knew that to be the case, so we didn't ask to go anywhere. And that's why I played basketball, I ran track, I was in chorus. I figured I'm gonna get out of the house one way or the other. And so that was the best way for me to get out. But I also know that they were protecting us. We did not need to be out, and they understood that. But they didn't say that to us directly. They just had their way of protecting us.
I see. I think we're out of time for the questions from me, so we'll turn it over to the audience now. And if you have any questions for our panelists, there's a microphone right there, and please come up and speak.
Okay, I guess I'm coming through more or less. But something I noticed, and I'm not too sure, the size of the military. The guard guys seem like normal size, but a lot of the airborne troops, with the pictures, they seem to be closer size to the students because they use lighter people. What I'm getting at is what the difference between the guard, that it was Harry Truman integrated the military, and with I didn't see any black troops, but I also assumed that at their regular base, there's a million where they were integrated. And the influence, would the 9 have worked out in integrated service?
Well, that's an interesting observation. Anyone else have a question? The panelists? No? Yes, okay, good.
Oh, thank you. Okay, hi. So I got to see Carlotta speak last week, and obviously I'm super white. So she said this quote that I really love. She had to get an advanced degree in Black people, and she just wanted white people to get a GED in Black people. So if you had one most important thing that you could share about what you would want us to understand, what would that be?
To understand about,
The Black experience, yeah.
that's interesting. You raised that question. When I was teaching in the counseling psychology program at WashU, and I created a course on seminar and counseling minority students, and predominantly Black. And so this one student asked me, what can I do short of reading a book or taking a course to learn more about Black people? And my sense was, at least you can do that, because it isn't something that just pops up. You got to pay some attention to it. And it involves looking at oneself in context, as well as the broader context. Now, I think that didn't answer your question directly, but if you could state it again, I want to do that. Yes. Yes. Right. And I think a lot of people have that kind of view and just don't want to take the time, or they say, well, you don't have to take get as much education to deal with Black issues as other people have to.
We could talk for about 5 or 6 hours, as you indicated. I'm not sure you would get it. But my grandmother used to say something to me that I still remember to this day. She says, no one is better than you, and you're not better than anyone else. If we all thought in that way and operated and treated people with respect and dignity, I think all of us would be better for it. But it all starts with respecting who you are, but also respecting others.
I think I heard the question. I would just say that when I think about the Black experience, I oftentimes see that as the mirror for the society. It is what is the kind of the conscious of America and the congruence between the purported values and stated laws and actions of this country. And so for me, it is a constant opportunity to ascertain, are we aligned with what the Constitution says, what the amendments say? Are we aligned with the what the interpretation is around what it means to be equal in this society, regardless of race, ethnicity, background, gender, and all of the things that might see us as different, but there's an intersection, and it's that intersection of being in this one America and what that means with all the rights and privileges of the society.
Yes, sir.
Yes. In my last year as president, then Chancellor Tim White asked me to chair a task force on ethnic studies. All right? And I was glad to do that. And in fact, it was a distinguished group of faculty members from across the system, students, several other presidents as well. And as we got together and began to discuss this, we decided that rather than talking about a task force on Black studies per se, that we wanted to talk about, describe it rather as a task force on the advancement of Black studies. Okay, not Black studies, I'm sorry, ethnic studies, ethnic studies. And so we met for almost a year and looked at everything you might want to look at. In the final analysis, we made several recommendations to the chancellor. The number one recommendation was that there should be at least a 3-unit course in the CSU that was required of all students for graduation. Okay? When the Board of Trustees looked at and understood that issue, their sense was, well, there's the other issue of social justice, which we all agreed with. And so they wanted the course to be in either social justice or ethnic studies. Our view was that that meant that students could get by without ever taking a course in ethnic studies. So as it turned out, one of the people that we talked to during the course of the task force was a faculty member, Shirley Weber. She used to be a faculty member in ethnic studies at San Diego State. And she was very good about talking about this set of issues. And she was in the legislature at that time. And the legislature made the decision to have a course in ethnic studies required, a 3-unit course. And so that became the requirement in the CSU rather than a course in either ethnic studies or social justice. Again, most of us felt that, sort of getting back to the earlier point, at least a 3-unit course in ethnic studies would be the minimum that one would expect of a student graduating from the CSU.
Are there any more questions?
Well, I think there are
Oh.
quite a few, but we are pushing 7 o'clock and
Okay.
we have a really important component of our program that I would hate for people to drift away from before we have Dr. Dugan to speak. So I do want to say, and Kurt and Chris can confirm this or deny, but I believe that most, if not all of our fabulous panelists have been interviewed for the CSUB Oral History Project. And therefore, if this is part of the Historical Research Center and their oral history archives, if you want to know more about their experiences and the things they shared in those oral interviews, that would be a great place to start. And I'm delighted that we have that in our archives as part of our permanent record. on Star Trek or something here. I think we have been incredibly privileged this evening to get to hear these three wonderful people who have a strong connection to our campus, either currently serving or formerly in important administrative positions. And I could listen to them for another hour easily, and I think others of you could too, and no doubt have questions you'd really like to ask. So my apologies, things got off a little late here, so we have run behind all evening. But I do want to honor some measure of time for everyone. And Dr. Dugan was really gracious about her willingness to talk about sort of where we are now. What is the state of education for Black students here at CSUB now? And so I would really like to give her the opportunity to share what she's done. She can say a lot more about it. And I don't know how much, there might be one question afterwards. But before she comes up, could you just join me in giving a heartfelt thanks to our panelists? And Dr. Dugan is from the sociology department, and Professor Dugan, you come up and share your insights with us.
I even set my timer, so this is an empowering thing to do, is to lift the mic up and a clicker and everything. So thank you, Dr. Vivian, for that introduction. And I want to thank the Public History Institute and the committee for inviting me this evening. I am humbled to be following such a great panel, and I agree, we could be here all night, or there should be a part 2 or part 3. Hint, hint, maybe. But I do want to make a couple comments before I talk about something that I'm working on with some colleagues here at CSUB regarding the current context of higher education. And I do want to say, Dr. Garcha, I know your comments at the end of your talk regarding that you're not Black, but you're teaching African-American history. I really appreciate that. And I'll speak for myself, but I appreciate that you are here to teach it. So thank you. So start my timer. Just a couple comments. As I was listening to our panelists, I was sort of thinking, okay, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm talking about the post-civil rights era. So just to give you a little bit of context of what that is, in sociology, we definitely look at what happens in the pre-civil rights era, is what we've heard from our esteemed panelists. But we also like to look at, well, what's happening in the contemporary era? And what does that look like? There was a point in time where we would say racism, systemic racism, may not be as overt or open, but unfortunately, I'm here to report that we're shifting back to that in the past few years. But just a couple of comments I wanted to reflect on as a Gen Xer as part of the post-civil rights era, and not just understanding how changes the legislative changes have impact Black experiences, but also sort of the everyday. But two comments. One, the discussion about Black parents and giving Black children advice has not stopped. That's not something that's a pre-civil rights era context. I remember my parents giving me similar messages growing up outside of St. Louis in the Metro East as a military kid at Scott Air Force Base, telling me, it's something we say in sociology, it's called racial socialization. So we have a socialization process where you learn all the norms and values and practices in society, but there's something else with racial socialization where you learn how to navigate spaces, right? And prepare Black children, right, for those experiences. And so I remember my parents navigating that binary of being encouraging, but yet at the same time giving warnings, right? And even though growing up, and I'm gonna, as a Gen Xer, late 70s, early 80s, I still had experiences of being called the N-word while riding my bike. So those things don't stop. And so that's one memory I have. And then the second, as an Air Force brat, if I may refer to myself as that, I attended schools that were interesting, a little more integrated because of the nature of military life and having families of diverse racial, ethnic, and nationalities in terms of backgrounds. But I would say, looking back at my elementary school experience, I may have been of one of 3 or 4 Black children in a class, right? So I guess that would have been progress perhaps at that time. But to base off of Dr. Wallace's experience of saying how he did not have a Black teacher, I believe you said until your junior college experience, right? Or when was master's experience, okay, excuse me. It's not lost on me that I have had Black students within the past year tell me the same thing who attend this university, that I am their first Black, not professor, Black teacher ever in 2021. So some of the things, many of the things that that had been discussed by our panelists are still happening today. And that's I don't know what to say about that, but they will say, you're my first Black teacher, which is another panel presentation. But I'm here today to talk about and highlight some of the experiences of what's happening here with Black students in higher education at CSUB. So I want to start off because I think it's important. Yes, I'll talk about what I'm doing with some colleagues, but I think it's important to highlight, and some of those students are here this evening who are involved in Black clubs or in clubs that are led by Black students. So I apologize if I've left a club off the list, but I do have Black Student Union, African American Student Association, SQE that is led by Black Student Dancers United, led by Black Student Excel Scholars. And if you need to find out what other clubs exist, go to that link and find out. So I do want to acknowledge if there are any Black student club leaders in this crowd, please stand up. Do not be scared or shy. Thank you. And I know, I appreciate you. I just want to give you that shout out and acknowledgement. And I know the Black Student Union, you all just, I think, returned from the AV campus, if I'm not mistaken, today to visit Black students at our campus in Lancaster. And so I wanted to give the Black student clubs a mention because in addition to the context of a post-civil rights society, we also have context of a unstable economy and the elephant in the room, the pandemic, and putting those aspects into context as well. And what that means, not just for Black students, but for all students, but in particular, what was that experience like for Black students on our campus? And so just to give you some fast, quick stats, I wouldn't be a sociologist if I didn't do that. I couldn't find data for 2020, but if you look at roughly from fall 18, a little bit pre-pandemic and now post-pandemic, we've held about the same percentage. There is a slight drop in fall 2021. I'll be interested to look at the fall 2022 data. And this is from the Fast Facts document from IRPA on campus. So, so I every year I try to look and see what that percent is relative. So for fall 2021, out of over 10,500 students, there are 421 Black students. So just to put that in perspective. So while I love statistics and quantitative data, I'm here today to talk with you a project that I'm working on with some colleagues in regard to look at what we might say more qualitative data to get at the deeper experiences of Black students at our campus. But that data, I just wanted to present to you all to give some context in terms of the trends. So for the rest of the time, very briefly, I'm going to talk about a project that I'm working on with some colleagues here at CSUB, their names on the screen, Doctors Ma, Roberts, and Salisbury with their departments, as a project that we started during the pandemic out of our informal discussions and kind of wondering what's going on with our students and then what's going on with Black students in particular in that very no, but that doesn't help the does that work? So in this study, based on our conversations, casual observations, and just talking informally with Black students, primarily virtually, we decided to come up with this project to look at and address a gap, a paucity in the research that talks about what are the experiences of Black African-American students at what we say minority serving institutions. So there's lots of research that focuses on Black students, African-American students' experiences at historically white institutions, predominantly white institutions, and at HBCUs. So we came up with a question, what are the experiences of Black students that are at a minority serving institution like an HSI or what we call AAPI, which is Asian American Pacific Islanders, or a tribal college. And so that's where we've set the context for this research. So we've started the project. We are currently in the midst of trying to find Black African-American students on our campus doing semi-structured virtual or in-person interviews from students at both campuses, because we want to understand the experiences of students, Black students at our AV campus, and because they're in LA County, they have a slightly higher Black population. So we want to make sure we're inclusive of their experiences. So what I'm going to share with you very quickly are just some very, very preliminary findings, but if any of you who do qualitative research and interviewing, one of the pleasures is that you can start to do analysis while you're still collecting data. So I'll share some of that with you. So we came up with interview questions that we called areas of concern, what we're focusing on in terms of academic experiences, extracurricular activities, any type of racialized interpersonal experiences they may have had on campus, whether it's in the classroom, outside the classroom, and also asking, because of the pandemic, what is their well-being? Not just academically, but emotionally, socially. We don't ask too much about the finance and their business on that end, but just sort of an overall understanding of their experience, right? And if any other areas of concern emerge, we follow with that line of questioning, but this is what we started with in terms of asking questions. So some preliminary, very, very preliminary, because it's based on a small number of interviewees. One, you might say thematic areas. One is that what came up a lot was learning during and I'm saying after the pandemic, in a waning pandemic perhaps. And a lot of that struggle was how to navigate course modalities, bridging connections with professors, things like that. So I could go into more detail, but I don't want to talk too much because we still need more data on that. However, there was a lot of discussion about extracurricular involvement, and in particular, developing connections with Black students or redeveloping them, right? So how can we start to build those connections back to feel more integrated on campus, and not just in a racial sense, but also feeling like you're a member of CSUB, right? Students talked about they've had opportunities for academic support and mentorship on campus and talked about that. Even one student having the experience of doing some research during the summer, working with a faculty member. So those things are there. And this came up, discussion of having more Black-centered events on campus, such as this one, but also perhaps having the presence of a Black cultural center on campus where it would sort of house events, have staff there. So those were some of the things that students also said they would like to see on campus, and that increased opportunity. So one theme that, and this is echoing what we've heard already, is that some students stated that they want to see more people who look like them. And we've heard that phrase before, but the phrase is still being said. So here's a couple quotes from students that I took from the data, and it said it would motivate Black people, and he means Black students, to try to be more successful in their grades and stuff like that. If we saw a Black teacher being successful doing what they're doing. So this idea of representation is still very, very important, right, in terms of students. They also talked about also seeing other Black students in their classes, which they don't see many, and we're still in this weird modality of virtual and in person, so it's still a little messy, for lack of a better word, but for some students who have majors that are in NSME where they don't see a lot of Black students like them, that's something they're trying to figure out and navigate. But they also did talk about developing mentorship opportunities despite not having Black faculty, so that's an important part. And then another quote that a student mentioned, and they said, because I'll be honest, I will like a mentor that looks like me because they know how it feels to be me. That's a very powerful quote coming from our students. So issues of representation, while I don't have it on a slide, a couple students talked about experiencing racial microaggressions. If you don't know what those are little slights, comments where compared to a pre-civil rights era, you're not quite sure if somebody was being racist to you or not, where you leave the interaction thinking, was that racist? Or you knew it was, but you couldn't say anything because you're so caught off guard, right? And you're stunned. I've even had those experiences. You go, oh, I should have said that later, right? But some students did talk about where they weren't sure if they had experienced microaggressions or not. And I didn't want to put that on the slide because I don't have enough data to talk about that, but that has been mentioned. And then lastly, this was really good to hear so far that Black students were thinking about themselves. There's my timer. Perfect. Approaches to wellness. So they were hanging out with friends, whether it was virtually or in person. And I liked that we heard that they were making the time to take care of themselves, which was very, very encouraging. Whether it's playing video games or you're playing with someone else who's, virtually, or doing breath work, eating healthy. They talked about these things. So it was great to see that students were taking proactive steps to take care of themselves due to the stressors of the pandemic, potential racial microaggressions or what have you. And so I wanted to finish up with this quote that a student had said, and it was very encouraging to read this. And they said, it feels actually pretty good. And I keep every single word in, so the likes and ums make it more, real, I suppose. It feels actually pretty good, because I'm doing great as a Black student because I'm getting good grades so far. So that's helping me thrive for more excellence and try to get better grades and try to stand above the normal. And I thought that would be a nice way to wrap this up. So what we're seeing so far are, simply say, positive and some negative experiences, but I don't want to make any conclusions at this time as we're in the midst of data collection. And so I'm finished with this picture. So I looked on Flickr, CSUB has its Flickr, and I loved this picture of this student. I don't know who he is. I wish I did know him, but it was part of First Generation, and I think I can read it from here. I'm first because I get the chance to change a cycle of struggle and turn my degree, I think, help me out, Dr. Vivian, it says, intergenerational wealth for my family. And so that is I love that picture. I'm so glad I came across it because I think it's a way to help us to start thinking about what experiences of Black students are. And it doesn't touch the surface, but we are making grounds. And by the way, if there's any Black students in here that want to be interviewed, come see me after the presentation. So thank you very much. We will open it up.
I want to have us thank all the participants this evening, scholars, administrators, those who shared their early experiences in life, those who brought their scholarly chops to help us better understand something that's not a relic of the past. It's something we're living with still. And there's nothing I could say that is as valuable, memorable, inspiring, or enlightening as any of them. So what I will say is, besides thank you to our, tech people working their magic, is please exercise your right to vote tomorrow if you have not already done so, because that is something we can all do to try to make change. So thanks everyone, and travel safe.